The Gregorian mission or Augustinian mission was sent by Pope Gregory the Great in AD 596 to convert Britain's Anglo-Saxons, headed by Augustine of Canterbury. By the death of the last missionary in 635, the mission had established Christianity in southern Britain. Along with the Irish and Frankish missions, it converted other parts of Britain as well and influenced the Hiberno Scottish missions to continental Europe. By the time the Roman Empire recalled its legions from the province of Britannia in 410, parts of the island had already been settled by pagan Germanic tribes who, later in the century, appear to have taken control of Kent and other coastal regions. In the late 6th century, Pope Gregory sent a group of missionaries to Kent to convert Ethelbert, King of Kent, whose wife, Bertha of Kent, was a Frankish princess and practicing Christian. Augustine was the prior of Gregory's own monastery in Rome, and Gregory prepared the way for the mission by soliciting aid from the Frankish rulers. Along Augustine's route, in 597 the 40 missionaries arrived in Kent and were permitted by Ethelbert to preach freely in his capital of Canterbury. Soon the missionaries wrote to Gregory telling him of their success and that conversions were taking place. The exact date of Ethelbert's conversion is unknown, but it occurred before 601. A second group of monks and clergy was dispatched in 601 bearing books and other items for the new foundation. Gregory intended Augustine to be the metropolitan archbishop of the southern part of the British Isles, and gave him power over the clergy of the native Britons. But in a series of meetings with Augustine, the long-established Celtic bishops refused to acknowledge his authority. Before Ethelbert's death in 616, a number of other bishoprics had been established, but after that date, a pagan backlash set in and the see, or bishopric, of London was abandoned. Ethelbert's daughter, Ethelburg, married Edwin, the king of the Northumbrians, and by 627 Paulinus, the bishop who accompanied her north, had converted Edwin and a number of other Northumbrians. When Edwin died, in about 633, his widow and Paulinus were forced to flee to Kent. Although the missionaries could not remain in all of the places they had evangelized, by the time the last of them died in 653, they had established Christianity in Kent and the surrounding countryside and contributed a Roman tradition to the practice of Christianity in Britain. Background: by the 4th century, the Roman province of Britannia was converted to Christianity and had even produced its own heretic in Pelagius. Britain sent 3 bishops to the Synod of Arles in 314, and a Gaulish bishop went to the island in 396 to help settle disciplinary matters. Lead baptismal basins and other artifacts bearing Christian symbols testify to a growing Christian presence at least until about 360. After the Roman legions withdrew from Britannia in 410, the natives of Great Britain were left to defend themselves, and non-Christian Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, generally referred to collectively as Anglo-Saxons, settled the southern parts of the island. Though most of Britain remained of Christian isolation from Rome bred a number of distinct practices. Celtic Christianity, including emphasis on monasteries instead of bishoprics, differences in calculation of the date of Easter, and a modified clerical tonsure. Evidence for the continued existence of Christianity in eastern Britain at this time includes the survival of the cult of St. Alban and the occurrence of eccles, from the Latin for church, in place names. There is no evidence that these native Christians tried to convert the Anglo-Saxon newcomers. The Anglo-Saxon invasions coincided with the disappearance of most remnants of Roman civilization in the areas held by the Anglo-Saxons, including the economic and religious structures. Whether this was a result of the Angles themselves, as the early medieval writer Gildas argued, or mere coincidence is unclear. The archaeological evidence suggests much variation in the way that the tribes established themselves in Britain concurrently with the decline of urban Roman culture in Britain. The net effect was that when Augustine arrived in 597, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had little continuity with the preceding Roman civilization. In the words of the historian John Blair, Augustine of Canterbury began his mission with an almost clean slate. Sources: most of the information available on the Gregorian mission comes from the medieval writer Bede, especially his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, or Ecclesiastical History of the English People. For this work, Bede solicited help and information from many people, including his contemporary abbot at Canterbury as well as a future Archbishop of Canterbury, Nuthelm, who forwarded Bede copies of papal letters and documents from Rome. Other sources are biographies of Pope Gregory, including one written in northern England around 700, as well as a 9th-century life by a Roman writer. The early life of Gregory is generally believed to have been based on oral traditions brought to northern England from either Canterbury or Rome, and was completed at Whitby Abbey between 704 and 714. This view has been challenged by the historian Alan Thacker, who argues that the life derives from earlier written works. Thacker suggests that much of the information it contains comes from a work written in Rome shortly after Gregory's death. Gregory's entry in the Liber Pontificalis is short and of little use, but he himself was a writer whose work sheds light on the mission. In addition, over 850 of Gregory's letters survive. A few later writings, such as letters from Boniface, an 8th-century Anglo-Saxon missionary, and royal letters to the papacy from the late 8th century, add additional detail. Some of these letters, however, are only preserved in Bede's work. Bede represented the native British Church as wicked and sinful. In order to explain why Britain was conquered by the Anglo-Saxons, he drew on the polemic of Gildas and developed it further in his own works. Although he found some native British clergy worthy of praise, he nevertheless condemned them for their failure to convert the invaders and for their resistance to Roman ecclesiastical authority. This bias may have resulted in his understating British missionary activity. Bede was from the north of England, and this may have led to a bias towards events near his own lands. Bede was writing over 100 years after the events he was recording, with little contemporary information on the actual conversion efforts. Nor did Bede completely divorce his account of the missionaries from his own early 8th century concerns. Although a few hagiographies, or saints' biographies, about native British saints survive from the period of the mission, none describes native Christians as active missionaries amongst the Anglo-Saxons. Most of the information about the British Church at this time is concerned with the western regions of the island of Great Britain and does not deal with the Gregorian missionaries. Other sources of information include Bede's chronologies, the set of laws issued by Ethelbert in Kent, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was compiled in the late 9th century. Gregory the Great and his motivations. Immediate background: in 595, when Pope Gregory I decided to send a mission to the Anglo-Saxons, the Kingdom of Kent was ruled by Ethelbert. He had married a Christian princess named Bertha before 588, and perhaps earlier than 560. Bertha was the daughter of Charibert I, one of the Merovingian kings of the Franks. As one of the conditions of her marriage, she had brought a bishop named Leodard with her to Kent as her chaplain. They restored a church in Canterbury that dated to Roman times, possibly the present-day St. Martin's Church. Ethelbert was at that time a pagan, but he allowed his wife freedom of worship. Leodard does not appear to have made many converts among the Anglo-Saxons, and if not for the discovery of a gold coin, the Leodard medal, bearing the inscription Leodard ACPs, his existence may have been doubted. One of Bertha's biographers states that, influenced by his wife, Ethelbert requested Pope Gregory to send missionaries. The historian Ian Wood feels that the initiative came from the Kentish court as well as the Queen. Motivations. Most historians take the view that Gregory initiated the mission, although exactly why remains unclear. A famous story recorded by Bede, an 8th-century monk who wrote a history of the British Church, relates that Gregory saw fair-haired Anglo-Saxon slaves from Britain in the Roman slave market and was inspired to try to convert their people. Supposedly Gregory inquired about the identity of the slaves, and was told that they were Angles from the island of Great Britain. Gregory replied that they were not Angles, but angels. The earliest version of this story is from an anonymous life of Gregory written at Whitby Abbey about 705 Bede, as well as the Whitby life of Gregory, records that Gregory himself had attempted to go on a missionary journey to Britain before becoming pope. In 595, Gregory wrote to one of the papal estate managers in southern Gaul, asking that he buy English slave boys in order that they might be educated in monasteries. Some historians have seen this as a sign that Gregory was already planning the mission to Britain at that time, and that he intended to send the slaves as missionaries, although the letter is also open to other interpretations. The historian N.J. Hel-hama speculates that Gregory had originally intended to send the British slave boys as missionaries, until in 596 he received news that Leodard had died, thus opening the way for more serious missionary activity. Hel-hama argues that it was the lack of any bishop in Britain which allowed Gregory to send Augustine, with orders to be consecrated as a bishop if needed. Another consideration was that cooperation would be more easily obtained from the Frankish royal courts if they no longer had their own bishop and agent in place. Hel-hama theorizes that Gregory believed that the end of the world was imminent, and that he was destined to be a major part of God's plan for the apocalypse. His belief was rooted in the idea that the world would go through 6 ages, and that he was living at the end of the 6th age, a notion that may have played a part in Gregory's decision to dispatch the mission. Gregory not only targeted the British with his missionary efforts, but he also supported other missionary endeavors, encouraging bishops and kings to work together for the conversion of non-Christians within their territories. He urged the conversion of the heretical Arians in Italy and elsewhere, as well as the conversion of Jews. Also pagans in Sicily, Sardinia and Corsica were the subject of letters to officials urging their conversion. Some scholars suggest that Gregory's main motivation was to increase the number of Christians. Others wonder if more political matters such as extending the primacy of the papacy to additional provinces and the recruitment of new Christians looking to Rome for leadership were also involved. Such considerations may have also played a part, as influencing the emerging power of the Kentish kingdom under Ethelbert could have had some bearing on the choice of location. Also, the mission may have been an outgrowth of the missionary efforts against the Lombards. At the time of the mission, Britain was the only part of the former Roman Empire which remained in pagan hands, and the historian Eric John argues that Gregory desired to bring the last remaining pagan area of the old empire back under Christian control. Practical considerations. The choice of Kent and Ethelbert was almost certainly dictated by a number of factors, including that Ethelbert had allowed his Christian wife to worship freely. Trade between the Franks and Ethelbert's kingdom was well established, and the language barrier between the two regions was apparently only a minor obstacle, as the interpreters for the mission came from the Franks. Another reason for the mission was the growing power of the Kentish kingdom. Since the eclipse of King Ceawlin of Wessex in 592, Ethelbert was the leading Anglo-Saxon ruler. Bede refers to Ethelbert as having imperium, or overlordship, south of the river Humber. Lastly, the proximity of Kent to the Franks allowed for support from a Christian area. There is some evidence, including Gregory's letters to Frankish kings in support of the mission, that some of the Franks felt they had a claim to overlordship over some of the southern British kingdoms at this time. The presence of a Frankish bishop could also have lent credence to claims of overlordship. If Leodard was felt to be acting as a representative of the Frankish Church and not merely as a spiritual advisor to the Queen, archaeological remains support the notion that there were cultural influences from Francia in England at that time. Preparations. In 595, Gregory chose Augustine, prior of Gregory's own monastery of St. Andrew in Rome, to head the mission to Kent. Gregory selected monks to accompany Augustine and sought support from the Frankish kings. The Pope wrote to a number of Frankish bishops on Augustine's behalf, introducing the mission and asking that Augustine and his companions be made welcome. Copies of letters to some of these bishops survive in Rome. The Pope wrote to King Theuderic II of Burgundy and to King Theudebert II of Austrasia, as well as their grandmother Brunhilda of Austrasia, seeking aid for the mission. Gregory thanked King Clothar II of Neustria for aiding Augustine. Besides hospitality, the Frankish bishops and kings provided interpreters and were asked to allow some Frankish priests to accompany the mission. By soliciting help from the Frankish kings and bishops, Gregory helped to ensure a friendly reception for Augustine in Kent, as Ethelbert was unlikely to mistreat a mission which enjoyed the evident support of his wife's relatives and people. The Franks at that time were attempting to extend their influence in Kent, and assisting Augustine's mission furthered that goal. Clothar, in particular, needed a friendly realm across the Channel to help guard his kingdom's flanks against his fellow Frankish kings.